An old man rolled up to the border in a quiet wheelchair. Seconds later, a customs dog leapt onto him without warning. When something slid out from beneath the blanket, even the agents couldn't believe what they were looking at. What was hidden under his legs, and why was he carrying it across the border alone? Up next is the full story, but first, drop your favorite dog's name in the comments and make sure you've hit subscribe. The morning haze hung low over the southern border crossing at Nogales, Arizona. Just beyond the checkpoint, a dusty sun rose over the scrublands and crumbling roadside signs, casting long shadows across the U.S. Customs and Border Protection lanes. Traffic moved slowly. Families in SUVs, produced trucks, day laborers crammed into vans, and among them an older man in a manual wheelchair waited in the shade of a blue and white tarp structure erected for secondary screenings. Agent Julian Reyes leaned against the steel railing just outside the screening lanes, his arms crossed loosely over his CBP vest. His canine partner Raya, a 5-year-old Dutch Shepherd with mottled brindle fur and alert eyes, sat obediently at his side, panting quietly. Raya was unusually calm that morning. She had completed 3 sweeps since dawn, 2 vehicle inspections and 1 baggage search, but showed no signs of fatigue or boredom. Her instincts were sharp. She wasn't the kind of dog to be distracted by meat wrappers or toys tucked into carry-ons. She was trained to detect narcotics, weapons, currency, and explosives, and something else, human stress signals, those unseen cues that pulse through the air when fear and desperation mix. Julian had learned long ago that if Raya so much as turned her ears in a different direction, something needed attention. That moment came when the elderly man in the wheelchair rolled up to lane 3. There was nothing unusual about him at first glance. Mid-70s, slight build, weathered face under a flat cap, a flannel shirt folded neatly over thin shoulders. His legs were covered with a blanket despite the desert heat. His passport said his name was Edward Lane, U.S. citizen, returning from a brief visit to Sonora. A driver, some cousin, had dropped him off at the Mexican side of the crossing, but now he was alone, inching his chair toward the customs booth without assistance. "Solo traveler?" Officer Grant asked from the booth window, scanning the passport. Edward nodded. "Yes, sir. Just me." Julian glanced toward the line casually until Raya stood up. No bark, no growl. Just that instant, precise, alert stance. Head up, eyes locked, her posture sharp and still as a taut wire. Julian followed her gaze. She was staring directly at the wheelchair. He gave a short, low whistle. Raya began to move, circling behind the booth toward the old man's side. Edward's eyes flickered briefly in her direction, but his face didn't change. "Sir," Julian said, stepping forward, "do you mind if my partner gives you a quick pass? It's standard procedure." Edward offered a tired smile. "No problem at all." But the moment Raya approached the footrest, her demeanor shifted. Her nostrils flared, tail low, hackles raised, not aggressively but with unmistakable focus. Then, in one swift, silent movement, she lunged forward, placing her front paws on the edge of the wheelchair footplate. There was a sharp clank. Something metallic slid from beneath the old man's blanket, bounced once on the concrete, and spun to a stop beside the wheel. It was a pistol, a compact 9mm safety off, with the serial number filed clean off the barrel. Everything around them froze. The lines stalled. Radios clicked on. Officers snapped to attention. Julian quickly moved Raya back and stepped forward. "Weapon," he called. "Clear the line. Secondary hold on lane 3. A perimeter was set up within seconds. Officer Grant drew his sidearm and moved in behind Julian, while Edward sat quietly, making no attempt to retrieve the weapon or flee. In fact, he didn't even flinch. The man simply looked down at the gun beside his foot and then back up at Julian. "I didn't know that was there," he said softly. It wasn't panic. It wasn't confusion. It was something else, something slower, sadder, almost rehearsed. Julian nodded to Officer Ramirez to secure the weapon. "We'll have to move you to secondary, sir." Edward raised both hands slowly. "Of course, whatever you need. Raya sat beside him again, not growling, not alerting further, just watching him. Secondary inspection room 2 was built like a bunker. Gray walls, frosted windows, no sound from outside. Inside, the air conditioning hummed cold and dry. Edward sat calmly, his blanket removed, wheelchair parked beside the table. The weapon had been bagged and logged. No fingerprints were found on the grip, wiped clean. Julian sat across from him. Raya curled at his feet. Her eyes, however, were still locked on Edward. "You want to tell us how that weapon got under your blanket?" Julian asked, voice even. "I can't," Edward replied. "You can't, or you won't?" Edward looked up, his eyes sunken but clear. "I've lived too long to confuse those two things." It wasn't the first time Julian had heard someone dodge a question, but this wasn't the usual tone of evasion. There was no anger, no deflection, just a stillness, a resignation in Edward's voice that suggested layers far deeper than smuggling. No aliases, no warrants, no criminal history, nothing out of place, except the gun. "Let's talk about the gun," Julian said, folding his arms. "Unregistered, wiped serial number? It didn't fall out of a carry-on or roll in from a truck inspection. It was under your legs. Are you saying you didn't know it was there?" "I'm saying," Edward replied, "there's more to this than what it looks like. And if you dig just the surface, you'll come to the wrong conclusion." Julian was trained not to get pulled into stories, but this wasn't just a story. There were no inconsistencies in Edward's account because there were no real details offered at all. No lies, no excuses, just space, open-ended space, a blank that demanded filling. Outside the room, Officer Ramirez approached with a file. His ID checks out. Edward Lane, 74 years old, veteran, worked as a supply logistics officer for the Army back in the 80s, retired, lives in an assisted housing complex in Tucson. No next of kin listed, no medical alert tags, nothing that indicates he should be crossing into Mexico alone. "What about the crossing history?" Julian asked. "Only one in the last 2 years. 3 days ago, same checkpoint, same wheelchair. And who signed him out of the complex?" Ramirez frowned. "That's the thing. No official record of him leaving." Julian looked back through the window at the old man. "Then who dropped him off?" "No vehicle plate logs matched. No security cam footage showing a drop-off. It's like he just appeared." Raya let out a soft whine, shifting slightly. Julian glanced down at her. That sound, subtle and low, was one she reserved for uncertainty. Not danger, not deception, just questions. And right now, everything about Edward Lane was a question. Later that evening, after processing the weapon and beginning paperwork for a potential federal charge, Julian walked Raya out along the fence trail to decompress. The dog hadn't relaxed all day. She was sensitive to tension, and something in that interrogation room had stirred her instincts long after the weapon had been taken away. Julian paused near the fence line, the sun bleeding out over the horizon in dusty streaks of orange and rust. Raya sniffed at the ground, ears flicking. Then she stopped. She sat, facing the east gate, a part of the checkpoint normally unused at night, and stared. Julian followed her gaze. There, about 30 yards away, was a beat-up white pickup truck parked half in shadow. No lights, no engine sound. He approached cautiously. No one was inside, but on the passenger seat lay a thin manila envelope. Inside, photographs. One showed Edward in his wheelchair beside a younger man, standing in front of a small adobe home. Another showed the same younger man at a border protest. The third, an X-ray image. Not Edward's. The label had been scratched off. Julian flipped the last photo. On the back, in shaky handwriting, "I had to do something before it happened again." He wouldn't listen to reason. There was no signature, no address, just the questions. And one growing suspicion. This wasn't about smuggling. It wasn't about crime. It was about something hidden deeper, and Raya somehow had known from the moment she saw Edward that he wasn't a threat. He was a man trying to protect something, or someone. But from what? And at what cost? Julian stood in the field office long after the lights had dimmed, flipping the photographs from the envelope like a silent slideshow. Each image told a fraction of a story still locked behind Edward Lane's unwavering silence. But it was the X-ray that kept gnawing at him. It showed what looked like a thoracic cavity with a metallic object near the sternum, a bullet, or shrapnel, possibly lodged near the heart. But the name had been blacked out with marker and the date blurred under smudges. That X-ray hadn't just been left as a clue, it was a warning, or maybe a confession. Across the room, Raya was curled beneath Julian's desk, but her eyes were open, ears twitching every so often. She hadn't taken her gaze off the office door for over an hour. Julian reviewed the photo with the younger man again. He couldn't be more than 30. Short hair, clean cut, but with sun-darkened skin and a certain stiffness in posture, military maybe. In the background was a white stucco house with faded blue trim. Scrawled on the back of the photo was one word, Tomas. Julian pulled up the agency's shared case database. He started with the basics, border crossings, incidents involving weapons, any mentions of a Thomas Lane or anyone connected to Edward Lane. At 3:27 a.m., something hit. 6 months prior, a report filed under Homeland Security noted a civilian shooting in Nogales, Sonora. No charges were filed. The Mexican authorities ruled it self-defense. The shooter? A man named Tomas Lane, age 29, victim, unidentified male. No passport, found with extensive tattoos linked to a regional cartel. The only reason the case made it into the shared U.S. database was because the shooter was a dual national. Thomas had a U.S. passport. He returned to Tucson 3 days after the shooting and hadn't been seen since. No forwarding address, no contact, no follow-up. Julian leaned back in his chair. Tomas was the missing link, the reason for the gun, the reason for Edward's silence. And suddenly, the envelope in the truck didn't feel like a message from Edward. It felt like a message about Tomas. At the holding center, Edward Lane hadn't slept. The blanket they'd offered him had been folded neatly on the cot. He sat in the wheelchair, unmoving, watching the steel door as if it were a window. When Julian walked in, Raya at his heel, Edward gave the faintest nod as though he'd been expecting them. "I looked into Tomas," Julian said. "No reaction. I know he's your grandson." A long pause, then Edward blinked. "He didn't tell me to bring the gun." Julian didn't reply. Edward shifted slightly. "He didn't even know I still had it." "What happened in Sonora, Edward?" Silence. Julian stepped closer. "Because what I think is this. Tomas shot someone dangerous, someone who wasn't supposed to survive. And now you think that someone or their people might come looking." Edward's jaw clenched for a moment. "They already came." That one sentence landed like a heavy stone. Julian waited. "I got the first call 2 weeks ago," Edward said, voice hushed. "Didn't recognize the number. It was a voice I didn't know, asking if I still lived in Tucson. Told me Tomas had left a debt unpaid. Said if he wasn't reachable, the family would do. Said the same rules apply." "What kind of debt?" "The kind Tomas thought he paid with his life. But he was wrong." Edward's hands fidgeted with the corner of his flannel shirt. The years fell off his expression then, not in the way a man turns young again, but in how the weight of living presses harder when you start speaking what you've kept hidden. "They never said what they wanted, exactly. Just that if Tomas didn't show up, I would be made to understand what regret feels like." "Why didn't you tell the police?" "And say what? That a cartel ghost called me? That a half-deaf grandfather thought he heard a threat in a voice he couldn't place?" Julian didn't push. Edward continued. "I couldn't find Tomas. He's gone off the grid. Said he needed time. I thought maybe I could, I don't know, get their attention, make them realize there was nothing left to take." Julian frowned. "So you went to Mexico?" "I went to end it, one way or another. And the gun." Edward closed his eyes. "Insurance. I hadn't touched it in 20 years. I didn't even know it still worked. But if someone came to collect on a phantom debt, I wasn't going to just sit and listen. It was irrational, hopeless. but it was also deeply human. A man in his 70s facing ghosts he didn't create, trying to shield the only family he had left from a threat neither of them had truly escaped. Raya let out a low whine. Julian looked down and saw her eyes locked again, this time not on Edward but the window. Outside, Agent Sandoval waved frantically from the hall. Julian excused himself and stepped out. "What is it?" "We've got a report from the Tucson shelter. A woman just came in, bruises, shaken up. Says she overheard something. 3 men in a diner near the interstate, talking about an old man crossing the line soon and sending a message if Tomas doesn't come clean." The woman thought they were joking until one of them showed a photo. Julian's pulse picked up. "What kind of photo?" She said it was a man in a wheelchair. Blue flannel shirt. Looked like a surveillance photo, grainy, maybe taken through glass. Julian felt a jolt run through him. Edward Lane. Exactly. Julian stepped back into the holding room. "Edward, I need to move you. Right now." "I told you," Edward said, not flinching. They were watching. Hours later, Edward was relocated to a safe house 30 miles north under U.S. Marshal supervision. The weapon charge was suspended pending further investigation. The gun had been traced to an old Army surplus sale, but its ownership chain had gone cold after 2002, nothing that could stick right away. And right now, Julian's priority wasn't prosecution, it was prevention. But one thing still bothered him. Tomas was still missing. Edward didn't have a way to reach him, and Julian's database checks had dried up. If Tomas didn't surface, the threat would only grow darker. That night, Julian stayed late in the field office with Raya beside him, the white envelope from the pickup truck spread out again. He looked at each photograph, each scribbled word, and then he saw it. In the corner of the photo with Tomas and Edward on the adobe wall behind them was a house number, faded but legible. 3328. Julian cross-checked addresses near the Nogales border. On a hunch, he added nearby shelters to the list. Third result down, Casa Esperanza Shelter, Nogales, Sonora. He made the call. The woman who answered confirmed the address had once been listed for a Thomas Lane, but he hadn't stayed there in months. Still, she remembered him well. "Quiet kid," she said. "Used to bring supplies to the back kitchen, always asking if any of the migrants had injuries or needed transportation." Julian's heart rate rose. Transportation to where? Border medics. Sometimes to private homes. Once, even to an old man's house. Said he owed him. What was the old man's name? She hesitated. Lane, same as his, said it was his abuelo. There it was again. The bond. Beyond paperwork. Beyond legality. Something more primal. The line between obligation and love blurred beyond distinction. That connection had brought Edward to a crossing with a weapon under his legs. It had sent Tomas into hiding, and it had brought Raya with nothing more than instinct and scent to the truth buried beneath a wool blanket and a lifetime of silence. But the story wasn't over. Because as Julian hung up the call, his office phone rang. The voice on the line was tired, cautious, but clear. "This is Tomas. I heard what happened. I want to talk." The call came just after 3 a.m. The voice on the other end was strained, heavy with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something too long, too deep. "I heard you have my grandfather." Julian sat upright, pen forgotten in his hand, Raya perking up from her spot on the floor. "Thomas Lane?" The voice paused. "Yes." Julian leaned forward. "He's safe. We moved him to a secure location." Another pause. "I want to explain everything," Tomas said, "but not over the phone. I'll come in. Where? Somewhere neutral. I'll give you the place, but no uniforms, no cuffs. You bring the dog if you need proof I'm clean." The conditions weren't unreasonable. 3 hours later, under the faint pink glow of early morning, Julian arrived at an abandoned rest area 20 minutes east of the Nogales checkpoint. The lot was empty except for a faded white Jeep parked under a sun-bleached tree. Raya jumped down from the SUV, alert but calm. Julian approached on foot. Thomas Lane stepped out of the Jeep, his features sharp and sun-weathered like in the photograph, but his eyes were older than 30. He raised his hands, no weapons. "I brought nothing but the truth," he said. Raya didn't bark, didn't growl. She simply walked forward and sat. Julian took that as his sign. They talked on the picnic bench, surrounded by silence. Tomas didn't rush. He told the story slowly, with pauses that spoke more than the words themselves. After he returned from the Marines, Tomas had struggled, not just with the war or the transition, but with the emptiness of it all. He'd found temporary purpose working with a border aid group, volunteers who gave water, food, and basic medical help to migrants who made it through the desert. One of those migrants was a young woman named Lita. She'd made it across with her younger brother. They were escaping a local cartel who had marked them after Lita refused to become a courier. She had seen too much, something she shouldn't have. Thomas gave them shelter, tried to help them disappear, but 2 weeks later a man came looking. Not police, not immigration, someone else. Tomas confronted him outside the shelter. There was shouting, then a gun, then a shot. The man went down, blood soaked into the sand. Tomas ran. He buried the weapon in the desert thinking it was over. He never knew who the man really was. But within days, word spread. Someone had found the girl, found her brother, and found Tomas's name. So he vanished. He told no one, not even Edward. "But my grandfather knew," Tomas said, voice brittle. "I don't know how, but he always knows when I'm running from something. He sent me a message through one of the shelters, a note telling me to stop disappearing and start facing things." Julian didn't interrupt. The pieces were falling into place. "I didn't listen," Tomas continued. "But they found him anyway. I knew the minute they threatened him that I'd made the wrong choice. He should never have been involved." "He wasn't," Julian replied. "He inserted himself." Thomas nodded, fighting to stay composed. "That's who he is. He fought in wars I never read about, lived through things we don't even teach anymore. But all he's ever cared about is protecting what little family he has left." Julian looked at the man across from him, haunted, raw but deeply human. "You have proof of what happened?" Julian asked. "Yes," Thomas said. He pulled out a weathered manila folder. Inside were handwritten letters, shelter intake forms, photos of Lita and her brother, bruised and terrified. There was even a grainy video taken on a burner phone of the man Thomas shot, yelling and flashing a badge that didn't look official. Julian glanced at Raya. She was still sitting, steady, as though guarding more than just a perimeter, as if she understood every word. Back at the safe house, Edward Lane sat near the window, watching the sunrise stretch slowly over the desert. The air was still cool, and the quiet wrapped around him like a fragile cocoon. He hadn't asked for updates, hadn't demanded to know what happened next. He just waited. When the SUV finally pulled up, Raya was the first through the door. She trotted in slowly, then sat beside Edward's wheelchair. Julian stepped in next, then Tomas. For a long moment, the two men said nothing. Then Edward reached out a hand. Tomas dropped to his knees beside the wheelchair, resting his forehead against his grandfather's hand like a child seeking forgiveness without asking for it. The silence in the room swelled, not empty, but filled with things too deep for words. Later that day, Julian filed the paperwork. Homeland Security and federal investigators began opening the files. The X-ray in the envelope turned out to be of the man Tomas had shot. He had survived with the bullet lodged in his chest and had since gone underground, likely plotting revenge through threats and intimidation. With the proof Tomas provided, Edward's weapon charge was formally dropped. Tomas agreed to cooperate in a broader investigation that would expose a network of coercion and infiltration along both sides of the border. But for now, what mattered most wasn't the system or the trial. It was the quiet moments. Moments like the one later that evening when Julian returned to his desk and found a small note wedged under Raya's water bowl. A thank you, written in Edward's careful handwriting. "Sometimes the dogs know before we do. Trust them, Agent Reyes. They see what our pride won't let us admit." Julian looked down at Raya. She was resting again, eyes half-lidded but watchful. ears twitching with every movement in the office. She hadn't just found a weapon that day. She had found a story buried beneath years of silence, pride, fear, and survival. And somehow she had known it all along. Epilogue. 1 year later. In a modest desert neighborhood outside Tucson, a small backyard hummed with the late afternoon wind. Flowers bloomed along the edge of a worn wooden fence. A bird feeder hung crooked on a pole. And near the back porch, a small ramp led to a wheelchair-accessible deck. Edward sat on the porch, a knit blanket over his lap, sunlight soft against his face. Inside, Thomas worked at the kitchen counter, coffee brewing behind him. And beside Edward, lying in the shade with her head resting on her front paws, was Raya. She wasn't a working dog anymore. After everything, after saving a family, uncovering a story that no one else could see, Julian had asked the agency for one favor. Let Raya retire with the man she saved. They agreed. Now Raya lived where she belonged, with the man who taught his grandson how to protect the innocent, and the grandson who finally learned what strength really meant. Julian still visited now and then, sometimes bringing biscuits for Raya and staying for coffee with Edward. They rarely talked about the border or the past. Some things didn't need retelling. As Julian prepared to leave that last time, Edward looked down at Raya and then up at the agent. "You were right," he said. "It wasn't the weapon that needed finding." Julian smiled. It was the truth. That's it for today. Please hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And don't forget to subscribe, because these incredible K9 moments, the next one might just top this, and you won't want to miss it.